What if I told you the Garden of Eden never actually disappeared? What if it's still out there right now, guarded by beings so powerful that even after 6,000 years, they haven't moved from their post? Everyone knows Adam and Eve were kicked out of paradise, the forbidden fruit, the serpent, the exile into a world of pain and death. But nobody talks about what happened to paradise itself after they left. And that's the real mystery, the one that'll keep you up tonight. Because the Bible gives us one terrifying detail that most people skip right over. God stationed armed angels at the entrance with a flaming sword that turns in every direction, still guarding, still watching, still protecting something. But here's the question that changes everything. Why would God need guards for a place that no longer exists? Why protect an empty garden for thousands of years? Why post cherubim with flaming swords at a gate that leads nowhere? What's inside that's so valuable, so dangerous, so sacred, that it requires the most powerful beings in creation to stand watch over it even now, in the 21st century, millennia after the last human walked its paths? This is Secret Origins, and what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about the beginning of human history, about the nature of paradise, and about where Eden really went when humanity was cast out. You're going to discover something that mystics have whispered about for centuries, something that modern physics accidentally proved might be true, something that connects ancient prophecies to quantum theory and makes the impossible suddenly, disturbingly plausible. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, whether you're trying to fall asleep, searching for answers, or simply curious about the mysteries that history has tried to bury, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell. It tells us you want to explore more deep journeys into forgotten truths, and it means you won't miss what's coming, because the stories only get stranger from here. But for now, let the silence wash over you like water. Breathe slowly and feel the weight of the question we're about to answer. Close your eyes if you can, and let me take you back to a place and time that should never be visited. The last morning in paradise, the moment everything changed, the day the gate closed and the guards appeared and the long exile began. In the next few minutes, you'll discover 3 theories about what happened to Eden after Adam and Eve left, each one supported by ancient texts and historical accounts and strange testimonies from people who claim they saw something they couldn't explain. And I promise you, the third theory will challenge everything you believe about the nature of reality itself. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Last Day in Paradise. You're standing at the eastern gate of Eden on the last morning Adam and Eve will ever see this place, and the light is different from any light you've ever known. It doesn't come from a single point in the sky the way sunlight does, doesn't cast shadows in predictable directions, doesn't fade or strengthen with the hours. Instead, it seems to emanate from everywhere at once, from the leaves of the trees and the surface of the water and the air itself, as though the garden is generating its own illumination from some inner source of radiance that has nothing to do with stars or fire or any light source you could name. The colors are more vivid than they should be, more saturated, more alive, as if every flower and stone and blade of grass is dialed up to an intensity that shouldn't exist in the natural world. And when you try to look directly at certain plants, you almost have to squint because they're too beautiful, too perfect, too much for eyes that were designed to see a fallen world. The air carries weight but not humidity, presence but not pressure. And when you breathe it in, you feel something subtle shift inside your chest. Not pain exactly, but awareness. As though this atmosphere contains elements that your lungs were designed for, but have never encountered. As though you're finally breathing what breath was always meant to be. The silence is complete, but not empty. There are no insects buzzing because there's no decay for them to feed on, no wind rustling through branches because there's no chaos in the atmosphere to create turbulence, no bird calls warning of predators because there's nothing here that hunts or fears or hides or struggles to survive. Instead, there's a kind of hum underneath everything. Not a sound exactly, but a vibration you feel in your bones and in your teeth and in the base of your skull, as though the entire garden is resonating at a frequency just below the threshold of hearing, as though creation itself is singing a note that only the body can detect. You watch as Eve turns back one last time, her hand reaching out to touch the bark of a tree that will never feel human warmth again. And the gesture is so tender and so final that it breaks something in you. Her fingers trace the patterns in the wood as though trying to memorize them by touch, as though she knows that memory will be all she has left, that every detail of this place will fade over years and decades until she can't quite remember if it was real or a dream she had before waking into the harder world beyond the gate. You can see in her face that she understands what's being lost, not just the comfort and the abundance, but something deeper, the sense of being exactly where you're supposed to be, the feeling of perfect belonging that she will spend the rest of her life trying to find again and never quite reaching. Adam's footsteps slow as he passes the river, that crystal stream that flows through the heart of the garden and splits into 4 branches that water the whole earth, and he bends down to cup his hand in the current one final time. He knows he'll never taste that water again, that whatever streams he drinks from in the years ahead will be different, lesser, tainted somehow by the soil they flow through and the air they evaporate into, and the brokenness that will seep into everything outside these walls. He drinks and closes his eyes, and you can see him trying to hold the sensation on his tongue, to preserve this last, perfect taste before stepping into a world where even water carries the memory of decay, where even the simplest pleasures will be complicated by effort and loss and the knowledge of what once was. The weight of what they're leaving is visible in the way they move, slowly, reluctantly, like people walking away from the deathbed of someone they love, knowing that once they cross the threshold, there's no going back, no second chances, no way to undo the choice that brought them to this moment. But here's what the Bible doesn't tell you. Here's the detail that Genesis leaves out. The moment that Scripture passes over in silence, as though it's too strange or too sacred or too disturbing to put into words. What happened in the seconds after they crossed the threshold? Genesis chapter 3, verse 24 says that God placed cherubim at the east of the garden, along with a flaming sword that turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. But when exactly did they appear? Did they materialize the instant Adam and Eve stepped beyond the boundary, shimmering into existence like heat mirages solidifying into flesh and fire? Or were they there all along, invisible, standing watch in dimensions that human eyes couldn't perceive, waiting for the moment when their presence would become necessary and visible? And if they appeared after the exile, what was there in that gap, that window of time when the garden stood unguarded and empty, when paradise existed, but no one remained inside it to witness its perfection? Did the trees continue to bloom with no one to see them? Did the river continue to flow with no one to drink from it? Did the animals wander the paths, calling for the humans who had named them and wondering where they'd gone? Think about it for a moment. Really sit with the strangeness of it, the profound loneliness of a perfect place with no one left to experience its perfection. The cherubim aren't described as gentle guardians or comforting presences. They're not the soft-winged angels of Renaissance paintings, or the chubby children of greeting cards, or the benevolent spirits of popular imagination. In the Bible, cherubim are something else entirely, something far older and stranger, and more terrifying than most modern readers understand, or want to understand. In the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest object in all of Israel, the physical location where heaven and earth touched, 2 golden cherubim stand over the mercy seat, where God's presence dwells between their wings, and no one could look at that space and live, except for the high priest once a year after elaborate purification rituals. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, when the prophet has his overwhelming vision of God's throne, the experience that left him unable to speak for 7 days, he sees cherubim described as creatures with 4 faces, human and lion and ox and eagle, their bodies covered with eyes that see in all directions at once, wheels within wheels spinning beside them like some kind of cosmic machinery, their movements like flashes of lightning, their appearance like burning coals of fire, so bright and terrible that Ezekiel can barely find words to describe what he's seeing. These aren't beings you'd want to meet on a dark road or find standing between you and something you desperately need. These aren't creatures that negotiate or compromise or feel pity for human weakness. These are the throne bearers of God himself, the guardians of the boundary between the holy and the common, the keepers of the line that cannot be crossed without being transformed or destroyed in the crossing. When Genesis says they were placed at Eden's gate, it's not saying they were posted there to have polite conversations with passing travelers or to give directions to lost wanderers. It's saying they were installed as an impenetrable barrier, a living wall of fire and divinity, and absolute refusal that would burn away anything unworthy that tried to approach. The text says they were given a flaming sword that turned in every direction, and if you dig into the Hebrew words used there, the details get even stranger. The phrase is Lahat hacharev hamitapechet, which literally means the flame of the blade that turns itself. And that word, mithapechet, comes from a root that means to overturn, to transform, to turn something inside out or upside down, or to fundamentally change its nature. This isn't a sword that someone waves around manually. It's a sword that moves on its own, that spins and rotates without human hand or even angelic hand, that guards not just by threat of violence, but by some kind of perpetual motion that makes approach impossible, that creates a barrier not through force, but through constant transformation of the space it occupies. Some scholars think this is metaphorical language for God's judgment, a poetic way of saying that anyone who tries to return to Eden will face divine wrath, swift and inescapable. Others think it describes something more literal, perhaps a natural phenomenon that ancient people didn't have words for or frameworks to understand. Maybe lightning that constantly flickered around the perimeter, creating an electrical barrier, or a volcano whose lava flows created an impassable ring of fire, or some kind of atmospheric disturbance that made the region uninhabitable, something that would have seemed supernatural to ancient observers, but that we might recognize today as a natural, if unusual, occurrence. But there's a third possibility that's stranger than either of those, a possibility that ancient Jewish texts hint at but never quite state directly. A possibility that makes modern physicists uncomfortable when you point out the parallels. What if the flaming sword isn't a weapon at all, but a barrier between dimensions, a kind of energetic membrane that separates the frequency of Eden from the frequency of the fallen world? What if it doesn't keep people out through threat, but through physics, through a fundamental incompatibility between what Eden is and what humanity became after the fall? What if the sword that turns every way is actually describing something rotating through dimensions we don't normally perceive, creating a seal between realities that can't be broken by physical force because it exists partially outside physical space? Think about how the text describes Adam and Eve's transformation after they ate the fruit. Their eyes were opened. They knew they were naked. They felt shame for the first time. They hid from God's presence when before they had walked with Him openly. Something changed in them, at a molecular or spiritual or perceptual level. Something shifted in their very nature that made them incompatible with the garden they'd been living in just moments before. And if that's true, if the fall was a change not just in moral status but in essential being, in the fundamental frequency at which they existed, then maybe the cherubim and the flaming sword aren't there to prevent entry so much as to mark the boundary between two states of existence that can no longer occupy the same space. Like oil and water that naturally separate, like matter and antimatter that annihilate on contact. Ancient Jewish texts, particularly the collection of commentaries and stories known as the Midrash, contain a haunting detail that Genesis leaves out. a piece of the story that makes the exile even more painful. They say that after Adam was expelled, he could still see the Garden of Eden from where he settled, that he didn't wander off into distant lands and lose track of its location, that he stayed close enough to watch, close enough to see the light that came from within it, close enough to remember exactly what he'd lost and where it was, and that he could never go back. Imagine living your entire life within sight of the home you can never return to. Imagine waking every morning to see the place where you were perfectly happy, where you walked with God in the cool of the day, where every need was met before you felt it, and every desire was satisfied before you could name it. And knowing that no matter how much you long for it, no matter how much you regret the choice that cost you everything, no matter how many times you walk to the edge of the boundary and stare at what lies beyond, you can never cross that line again. Some versions of these traditions say that on certain days when the wind blew in the right direction, Adam could smell the fruit he would never taste again, could catch the scent of flowers that grew nowhere else on earth, could breathe in just a trace of that perfect air, and feel his chest tighten with a longing so intense it was almost physical pain. Like hunger, but deeper. Like thirst, but for something water couldn't satisfy. They say that some nights, when the world was very quiet, and the barriers between things grew thin the way they do in the hours before dawn, he could hear sounds from within the garden. Not words or voices, but the rustling of leaves that never fell, the movement of water that never stagnated, the distant echo of a harmony that no longer existed anywhere else in creation, a music that made the silence afterward even heavier. Can you imagine that torture? Can you imagine the psychological weight of spending 930 years, the entire span of Adam's life according to Genesis chapter 5, living in sight of what you'd lost? Every achievement in the world outside would be measured against the perfection inside and found wanting. Every meal would taste like ashes compared to the fruit of Eden. Every shelter would feel like exile compared to dwelling in the presence of the divine. Every relationship would carry the shadow of the intimacy with God that had been lost. Maybe the cruelest punishment wasn't being expelled from paradise. Maybe it was knowing exactly what you'd lost, carrying the memory of perfection into a world that could never measure up, living every day with the knowledge that there once was something better, and you destroyed your own access to it through a single choice that seemed so small at the time. And this isn't just Adam's story. This is the human story. Every person since has felt some version of that same ache, that sense of displacement, that gnawing suspicion that we're supposed to be somewhere else, living some other kind of life. We try to name it in 1,000 ways. We call it ambition, or nostalgia, or wanderlust, or depression, or existential anxiety, or the midlife crisis, or the quarter-life crisis, or any of a dozen other labels we've invented to describe the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with our situation. But maybe it's simpler than all those words. Maybe it's just the genetic memory of Eden, passed down through generations like eye color or height or the shape of your hands. The soul's dim recollection that once upon a time we belonged somewhere, and now we don't. Every spiritual tradition has a version of this story, and that's worth paying attention to. That across cultures and continents and centuries, separated by oceans and mountains and vast spans of time, human beings keep telling the same story about a lost golden age. Hindus speak of Satya Yuga, the age of truth, when humans lived for thousands of years and Dharma was perfect, and the earth gave everything freely. Greeks told tales of the age of Kronos, when the earth produced fruit without labor, and no one knew war or sickness or the fear of death. Norse mythology remembers a time before Ragnarok, when the world tree Yggdrasil stood unthreatened, and the gods walked among men and women in harmony. Different names, different details, different gods and different trees, but the same core memory beating underneath all of them. We came from somewhere better. We lost it through some fault or fate or cosmic betrayal, and we've been trying to find our way back ever since. Maybe that longing you feel when you see a beautiful sunset and it's almost too much to bear, when the beauty actually hurts, when you want to weep for reasons you can't explain. Maybe that homesickness for a place you've never been, but somehow recognize. Maybe that restlessness that no achievement or relationship or experience ever quite satisfies for more than a moment. Maybe that's not a defect in you. Maybe that's your soul remembering Eden and reaching for it across the centuries. Maybe the ache isn't there to torture you, but to guide you, to remind you that you were made for something more than what you see, that this world of thorns and sweat and death isn't the end of the story, but the middle, the long exile between the garden that was and the garden that will be. But here's what keeps mystics and scholars awake at night. Here's the question that Genesis raises, but never quite answers, the mystery that has puzzled commentators for thousands of years. If Eden was sealed forever, if no human would ever walk its paths or eat its fruit or drink its water again, if the gate was closed permanently and the way back cut off completely, why did God need guards? Why station cherubim with flaming swords at a gate that leads to a place that no longer matters, that serves no function in the story anymore, that exists only as a monument to what was lost? If Eden was truly gone, destroyed in the flood or dissolved by time or transformed into something unrecognizable, then the guards are pointless. They're ceremonial at best, symbolic figures standing watch over nothing like sentries at a tomb of an unknown soldier. But if the guards are real and their vigil is ongoing, if they're still there right now, in whatever form they take and whatever dimension they occupy, then that means something inside the garden is still worth protecting, still dangerous or valuable or sacred enough to require the constant surveillance of the most powerful beings in creation. It means Eden didn't just sit there empty and abandoned after humanity left, slowly decaying like an untended garden in the normal world. It means something happened to it, something the Bible only hints at in fragments and shadows. Something that required the most powerful beings in creation to stand watch over it for thousands of years. What if the garden didn't remain static after Adam and Eve departed? What if it continued to exist, but began to transform, to evolve, to prepare itself for something that was coming? What if those cherubim aren't just keeping people out, but also keeping something in, maintaining the integrity of a space that operates by different rules than the rest of reality, protecting not just the tree of life, but the entire ecosystem of paradise from being corrupted or invaded or discovered prematurely by beings who aren't ready for what they'd find? And what if some people, throughout the long centuries of exile, found ways to glimpse what the guards were protecting, caught brief visions of what Eden became after humanity left, saw something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself, and came back changed, unable to fully explain what they'd seen, but certain that paradise was not gone, only hidden, only waiting. Are you still with me? Are you feeling that pull of the mystery? That sense that we're approaching something important? Keep listening, because what comes next will take everything we've just discussed and turn it inside out. Stay close, because the next chapter explores something darker and stranger than you'd expect. Because what we're about to examine will take us from ancient flood myths to archaeological evidence, from biblical chronology to geological catastrophe, from the question of what happened to Eden to the terrifying possibility that it was deliberately erased from the face of the earth. We're going to look at 3 theories about Eden's fate, each one supported by scripture and tradition, and strange historical accounts. And I promise you, by the time we reach the 3rd theory, you'll question everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality, about where paradise went, and about whether it might still exist in a form we simply haven't learned to perceive. The path continues, and the silence has more to say. Chapter 2. The 3 Theories of Eden's Fate. You're in a library older than most nations, One of those stone buildings where the walls themselves seem to hold memory, where dust floats through beams of afternoon light like tiny planets in slow orbit, where the smell of old paper and leather bindings creates an atmosphere so thick you can almost taste it on your tongue. The silence here is different from the silence of empty spaces. This is a silence full of words. Thousands upon thousands of them pressed into pages and waiting to be read, waiting to whisper their secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. In front of you, on a heavy wooden table scarred with centuries of use, lie 3 ancient manuscripts, each one bound in leather that's cracked and darkened with age, each one offering a different answer to the same question that's haunted humanity since the Gate of Eden closed. What happened to the garden after we left? Your fingers trace the edge of the first manuscript, and you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the temperature of the room. You feel it in your chest, in your spine, in that place behind your thoughts where intuition lives. These scholars who wrote these texts weren't guessing, weren't inventing fables to entertain children or comfort the grieving. They were reporting what they believed to be true, what they'd pieced together from scripture and tradition and testimonies of those who came before. 3 theories, each one supported by biblical passages and historical accounts and logic that seems sound until you examine the others, each one compelling in its own way, each one terrifying in its implications. One says Eden drowned beneath waters that covered the highest mountains, another says it withered and decayed without human hands to tend it, and the third says something far stranger, something that will make you question the very nature of reality and whether the world you see is the only world there is. Let's begin with the oldest and most widely accepted theory, the one that makes the most sense if you believe the Bible's account of what came next in human history. The first manuscript describes what many early Jewish and Christian scholars believed happened to Eden, and the logic is brutal in its simplicity. The Great Flood erased it from the earth. Think about the scope of what Genesis describes when it talks about the flood. This isn't a local disaster or a regional catastrophe. This is water covering the entire planet, rising above the highest mountains by 15 cubits according to Genesis chapter 7 verse 20, reshaping coastlines and filling valleys and moving entire rivers from their beds. If even the peaks of Ararat were underwater, if the mountains themselves disappeared beneath the surge, then a garden, no matter how special or protected or sacred, could not escape. The text is clear about this. Every high hill under the whole heaven was covered. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creature that swarms upon the earth, and every man. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. Nothing survived outside the ark, not the great civilizations that must have existed, not the cities, or temples, or libraries, or gardens. Everything was swept away and buried under layers of sediment that would eventually become the geological record we dig through today, searching for answers about the past. Supporters of this theory point to several compelling reasons why Eden would have been destroyed in the flood. First, there's the theological argument about the loss of perfection after the fall. Before sin entered the world, creation is described in Genesis chapter 1 as very good, perfect in every detail, functioning exactly as God intended. But after sin, everything starts to change. The ground produces thorns and thistles, childbirth becomes painful, work becomes toil, death enters the picture for the first time, and even the animals begin to fear humans and hunt each other where before they'd lived in harmony. In that world, in creation marred by sin and violence and corruption spreading through every living thing, the perfect order of Eden is out of step with everything around it. It's an anachronism, a remnant of a reality that no longer exists. According to this view, when the flood comes, it doesn't just judge human evil, it also wipes away the last untouched remnant of that earlier order. It resets the entire world to match the fallen state of its inhabitants. It removes the physical reminder of what was lost, so that humanity can move forward without constantly seeing the paradise they'd destroyed through disobedience. Second, there's the geographical argument about the flood's power to completely reshape the Earth's surface. Water on that scale doesn't just cover things temporarily and then recede, leaving everything as it was. Floods move rock and soil and entire riverbeds. They carve new canyons and fill old ones. They redistribute minerals and sediments across hundreds or thousands of miles. They fundamentally alter the landscape in ways that make before and after unrecognizable to each other. The Garden of Eden is associated with a river that went out of Eden to water the garden, and then divided into 4 headwaters according to Genesis chapter 2, the Pishon and Gihon and Tigris and Euphrates, 4 distinct river systems flowing from a common source. After a planet-shaping event like the flood, those waterways could be gone completely, or altered beyond recognition. Their courses changed, their sources dried up or buried, their names perhaps transferred to new rivers that had nothing to do with the original geography. In other words, even if the land where Eden once stood still exists somewhere, even if the soil and stones are still there, buried under layers of post-flood sediment, its defining features would be changed beyond recognition. The river system that identified its location would be obliterated, and any attempt to find it would be like trying to locate a specific house after a nuclear explosion has vaporized the entire city. There's also a spiritual reason that resonates with many believers, a kind of moral symmetry to the idea of Eden being destroyed in the flood. If the way to the tree of life was guarded to prevent eternal life in a fallen state, if God's whole purpose in blocking the return to Eden was to ensure that corrupted humanity couldn't eat from that tree and live forever in separation from Him, then the final removal of the garden during the flood matches the moral purpose that was already in place. The flood represents God's judgment on a world that had become so violent and corrupt that Genesis chapter 6 says, "Every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually." It represents a line being drawn, a point past which patience ends and consequences arrive. In that context, destroying Eden isn't cruelty, but completion. It's removing the last bridge back to innocence. It's acknowledging that the way forward isn't through recovery of what was lost, but through something new that God would build with Noah and his descendants. A second chance that wouldn't include access to the original perfection. But here's where the theory gets complicated. Here's where supporters have to wrestle with details that don't quite fit. If Eden was destroyed in the flood, why does the Bible never explicitly say so? You'd think that the erasure of paradise, the final destruction of humanity's first home, would merit at least a mention, at least a single verse acknowledging that the garden that began the story had now ended. But Genesis says nothing. The flood narrative talks about mountains and valleys and every living thing, but Eden is conspicuously absent from the list of what was lost. Some scholars argue this is an argument from silence, that the Bible doesn't mention every single consequence of the flood, and we shouldn't expect it to. But others find the omission strange, given how important Eden was to the setup of the human story. There's also the question of the cherubim and the flaming sword. If the flood destroyed the garden, what happened to the guards? Did they leave their post? Did they remain standing watch over ruins buried under miles of water and sediment? Genesis never mentions them departing or their mission ending, which suggests that whatever they were guarding continued to exist in some form, even after the flood reshaped the world. The second theory takes a different approach. Less dramatic, but perhaps more tragic in its implications. This view says that Eden wasn't destroyed by catastrophic flood, but by something quieter and slower, and in some ways sadder. It decayed without care. It withered and died like any garden does when the gardener abandons it, and nature is left to take its course. The Bible is explicit about this detail that many readers skip past. Genesis chapter 2 verse 15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it," which means that even paradise required maintenance, even perfection needed human hands to sustain it. Adam wasn't placed in Eden just to enjoy it passively, like a guest at a resort. He had a job. He had responsibilities. He was the gardener of paradise, and his work mattered to the garden's continued flourishing. When Adam and Eve were banished, no one was left to fulfill that role. The garden was left without its caretaker, and supporters of this theory believe that without human attention, it would have inevitably declined. Imagine the most beautiful garden you've ever seen. Imagine those formal gardens in Europe that take teams of skilled gardeners to maintain, where every hedge is trimmed, and every flower bed is weeded, and every path is swept, and every fountain is cleaned. And now imagine no one waters it for a year, for 10 years, for 100 years. The delicate flowers die first because they need the most care. Then the less hardy plants. Then weeds start to appear in the flower beds because there's no one to pull them. Then the weeds spread to the paths. Then trees that were carefully pruned start to grow wild, and their branches tangle and block the light to plants below. Then insects move in, and birds follow, and small animals make nests and dig burrows, and slowly, inexorably, the careful order imposed by the gardener gives way to the wild order of nature, which is beautiful in its own way, but utterly unlike the manicured perfection that existed before. Over time, perhaps over centuries, the garden would have simply blended back into the surrounding wilderness, becoming indistinguishable from any other part of the earth, and eventually wind and rain and the slow grinding of seasons would erase any sign that this had once been the home of humanity's first parents. Supporters of this theory point to the curse described in Genesis chapter 3, verse 18, where God tells Adam, "Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you," as evidence that the ground itself would resist human cultivation after the fall, that nature would become adversarial rather than cooperative. If the curse affected the ground everywhere, if thorns and thistles became the default production of soil that humans didn't actively combat, then even Eden wouldn't be exempt once its human caretaker was gone. Without Adam and Eve's daily care to tend and protect the garden, even the tree of life and the tree of knowledge would eventually be overtaken by the wild growth around them. Vines would climb their trunks, their fruit would fall and rot unpicked, their branches would tangle with less valuable trees until they were lost in the canopy. The paths Adam walked would disappear under fallen leaves and new growth. The clearings where he rested would fill in with saplings. The river might change its course over time as floods moved soil and debris. And within a few generations, perhaps within a century or two, the garden would look like any other forest. Beautiful perhaps, but no longer recognizable as the paradise described in Genesis. There's something deeply melancholy about this theory. Something that resonates with anyone who's ever seen a house fall into ruin, or a farm return to wilderness after the family leaves. It suggests that even God's perfect creation requires ongoing relationship with humanity to maintain its character, that we're not just inhabitants of earth, but participants in its flourishing. And when we're absent, things fall apart, not through dramatic judgment, but through simple neglect. It makes the exile from Eden even more painful, because it means Adam could have watched from outside the boundary as the place he'd loved slowly deteriorated, as the garden he'd tended with his own hands was reclaimed by forces he could no longer control, as paradise literally died from his absence. Some versions of this theory suggest that what we call wilderness today, the untamed forests and jungles that resist human order, might be the descendants of Eden, the genetic legacy of those perfect plants, now mixed with thorns and thistles and grown wild over millennia, carrying in their DNA some faint memory of what they used to be. But this theory also has problems that its supporters struggle to explain. If Eden decayed naturally, what happened to the tree of life? Was it really just another tree that could die from neglect or be choked out by weeds? The tree of life is described in Revelation chapter 22 as standing in the New Jerusalem, bearing fruit 12 months of the year, its leaves for the healing of the nations, which suggests it's not a normal biological organism subject to normal biological death. How could something with the power to grant eternal life simply wither away like a rose bush no one remembered to water? And again, there's the question of the cherubim. If the garden decayed into wilderness, if there's nothing left but forest and thorns, and perhaps some unusually old trees that no one would recognize as special, why are the most powerful beings in creation still standing guard? You don't post armed angels to protect an empty field or a patch of woods. You don't maintain that level of security over ruins or memories, which suggests that whatever they're guarding retained its essential nature even if its appearance changed. And that brings us to the third theory, the one that seems most far-fetched at first hearing, but that has surprising support from both ancient mystical traditions and, strangely enough, from modern physics. This theory says that Eden was never destroyed at all, that it didn't decay or drown or vanish. Instead, it was relocated, removed from the physical earth, and placed somewhere else entirely. According to ancient Jewish and Christian traditions that go back centuries before Christ, after Adam and Eve were expelled, God transferred the Garden of Eden to heaven. Not heaven as a vague spiritual realm, but as an actual location, a dimension or plane of existence that operates by different rules than the physical world we inhabit. In this view, Eden still exists in perfect condition, exactly as it was on the last day Adam saw it, but it's now in a place that humans cannot access in our current state. It's separated from us, not by distance or barriers, but by a dimensional boundary that normal human perception can't cross. Supporters of this theory point to later passages in the Bible where paradise is described not as something lost forever in the past, but as something that still exists and will be experienced again. When Jesus speaks to the thief dying on the cross next to him in Luke chapter 23, verse 43, he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise," using present tense, not "you would have been" or "you could have been if Adam hadn't sinned," but "you will be," as though paradise is a real place that still exists somewhere and can be entered. The book of Revelation describes the tree of life as standing in the New Jerusalem, that city that comes down from heaven in the final chapters of the Bible, which suggests that the tree was preserved somewhere during all the centuries of human history, kept safe and growing and bearing fruit in a realm beyond our current reach. If the tree of life will one day be available again, if its fruit will be eaten and its leaves will heal the nations, then Eden's most sacred element must have been maintained somewhere rather than destroyed. And if the tree was preserved, why not the entire garden? This idea of Eden existing in a heavenly dimension isn't just speculation or wishful thinking. It appears repeatedly in ancient Jewish mystical texts, in early Christian writings, in the testimonies of saints and prophets across centuries. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that didn't make it into most Bibles but was widely read and quoted by early Christians, describes Enoch being taken to see the Garden of Righteousness, where the tree of life grows, a place of incredible beauty that exists in what he calls the third heaven, neither on earth nor in the highest heaven where God dwells, but in some middle realm between the two. The Apostle Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, describes being caught up to the third heaven, where he heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. And many early Christian interpreters believed he was describing a vision of paradise, of the garden preserved in that intermediate dimension. The consistency of these accounts across different times and cultures suggests they're describing something real, some actual place that certain individuals were permitted to glimpse under special circumstances. But here's where this theory becomes truly fascinating. Here's where ancient mysticism and modern science accidentally end up describing the same possibility using completely different language. Stay with me, Because what comes next will either sound like science fiction or like the explanation you've been searching for your entire life without knowing it. And the strange thing is, it might be both at once. The path continues, and we're about to step into territory where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual become very thin indeed. Chapter 3. When Science Meets Scripture, the Quantum Eden. You're standing in a quantum physics laboratory at 3 in the morning, surrounded by machines that hum with a frequency you feel in your jaw and your sternum, screens displaying particle tracks that appear and disappear like ghosts, equations written on whiteboards in handwriting so dense it looks like another language, which, in a way, it is. The air smells like ozone and metal and coffee gone cold hours ago, and the scientist next to you, a woman who's spent 20 years studying the behavior of particles at the subatomic level, says something that makes your heart skip a beat. We've proven that multiple realities can exist in the same space, separated not by distance but by state, and we have no idea how many layers there might be, or what might exist in dimensions we simply can't perceive. You think back to those ancient texts describing Eden as hidden rather than destroyed, preserved in some realm beyond human reach, and suddenly, impossibly, a connection forms in your mind like a circuit completing, like two puzzle pieces that shouldn't fit but do. What if the mystics weren't speaking in metaphors when they talked about heavenly realms and dimensional boundaries? What if they were describing, in the only language available to them, the same reality that quantum physicists are now mapping with mathematics and particle accelerators? What if Eden exists right now, right here, occupying the same coordinates as the space you're sitting in, but vibrating at a frequency your 5 senses weren't designed to detect? Modern physics has discovered something that ancient mystics always knew, but couldn't prove: that reality is layered, that what we see and touch and measure is only one slice of what exists, that the universe is far stranger and more complex than common sense suggests. In quantum mechanics, which is the study of how the smallest particles behave, scientists have found that a single particle can exist in multiple states simultaneously until someone observes it, at which point it chooses one state and collapses into that reality. This is called superposition, and it's not theory anymore. It's been proven in laboratory after laboratory, demonstrated so many times that it's now accepted as fundamental to how the universe works at the quantum level. Schrödinger's famous thought experiment about the cat that's simultaneously alive and dead until you open the box wasn't meant to be literal. It was meant to show how absurd quantum mechanics seemed. But the absurdity turned out to be accurate. Particles really do exist in multiple states at once. Reality really does branch in ways that violate everything our everyday experience tells us is possible. Now, apply that principle not to a single particle, but to entire systems, to large-scale objects, to places. If a particle can be in 2 places at once, if it can have 2 contradictory properties simultaneously until observation forces it to choose, then what prevents a garden, a specific location with trees and rivers and paths, from existing in multiple states? What if Eden exists in a superposition, present in our dimension as ordinary geography, soil and stones and whatever grows there now, but also present in another state as the perfect garden described in Genesis? And these 2 states don't contradict each other. They're both real. They're both happening. They're just separated by something more fundamental than space or time. The many worlds interpretation, proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957, and now taken seriously by a significant portion of the quantum physics community, suggests that every possible outcome of every quantum event actually occurs, each one creating a new branch of reality, a parallel universe where a different possibility became actual. If you take this seriously, and some of the smartest physicists alive do take it seriously, then there are countless versions of reality existing simultaneously. Universes where you made different choices, where history went different directions, where the laws of physics might be slightly different or drastically different. all of them equally real, all of them happening now, separated from each other not by distance, but by quantum state. Could Eden exist in a parallel timeline, a branch of reality where the fall never corrupted it, where the garden continued in its original perfection, while our universe proceeded down the darker path of thorns and death? The Bible speaks of new heavens and a new earth in Isaiah chapter 65 and Revelation chapter 21. But what if that's not describing a future creation, but a parallel reality? Something that exists now but that we can't access because we're locked into this particular branch of the quantum tree. What if God's dimension and our dimension aren't separated by some mystical gulf, but by the same kind of quantum boundary that separates parallel universes? And what if certain individuals throughout history, through prayer or fasting or some accident of consciousness, briefly tuned into that other frequency and saw what was there? The language changes. Mystics call it the third heaven, or the heavenly realm, while physicists call it parallel dimensions, or alternate quantum states. But they might be describing the same thing, the same layered reality where multiple versions of existence occupy the same space without interfering with each other. Here's where it gets really interesting, where the metaphor becomes almost too perfect to be coincidence. Physicists studying parallel dimensions describe them as inaccessible to us under normal conditions, separated by what they call energy barriers that would require impossible amounts of power to cross. And that's the exact same word ancient texts use for Eden after the fall. Inaccessible, cut off, unreachable. Not because it's far away, but because it exists in a state we can't enter. The cherubim with the flaming sword that turns every way might be the ancient writer's attempt to describe what a dimensional barrier looks like to human perception, something that moves and shifts and blocks access not through physical force, but through a fundamental incompatibility between the state you're in and the state you're trying to reach. Think of a radio picking up stations. Dozens of programs are broadcasting through the same room at the same time. All those voices and music and information passing through the same cubic meter of space, but you only hear one because your radio is tuned to that specific frequency. Turn the dial slightly, and a completely different reality emerges. Not from somewhere else, but from the same location. It was there all along, you just weren't calibrated to perceive it. What if our five senses are tuned to what we might call the fallen world frequency, calibrated to perceive matter and energy in their corrupted state, in the configuration they took after sin entered creation and changed something fundamental about how reality operates? And what if Eden broadcasts on a different wavelength entirely, still occupying the same geographical location it always did, but vibrating at a frequency that human senses after the fall simply cannot detect? This isn't as crazy as it sounds. Our senses already miss most of what exists. We can't see ultraviolet light or infrared. We can't hear sounds above or below certain frequencies. We can't detect magnetic fields or radio waves without instruments. Our perception is limited to a tiny slice of the electromagnetic spectrum and an even tinier slice of possible states of matter. What makes us think we're perceiving all the dimensions that exist? What makes us so confident that the three spatial dimensions and one time dimension we experience are the only ones there are? String theory, which is one of the leading candidates for a unified theory of physics, requires at least 10 or 11 dimensions for the mathematics to work, and we can only perceive 4 of them. So where are the others, and what might exist in them? Neuroscience has discovered something fascinating about mystical experiences, about the states of consciousness that monks and saints and shamans report when they claim to have visions of other realms. When researchers use brain imaging technology to scan the brains of people in deep meditation or intense prayer, they find measurable changes in activity, particularly in areas associated with the sense of self and the perception of boundaries between self and environment. Dr. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist who spent decades studying what he calls neurotheology, has shown that people in these altered states aren't making things up or hallucinating in the sense of seeing things that have no external referent. Their brains are processing real information. They're perceiving something. The question is where that something exists and how they're accessing it. Mystics throughout history have used practices like fasting and prayer and meditation and breathing techniques to achieve what they describe as higher states of consciousness, or opening the inner eye. And what they're doing, in modern terms, might be changing their brain's frequency, tuning their perception to detect information that normally lies outside the bandwidth of everyday awareness. In deep meditative states, the brain produces what are called theta waves and gamma waves, frequencies of electrical activity that don't occur during normal waking consciousness. And people in these states consistently report experiencing realities that feel more real than ordinary reality. Dimensions of existence that seem to be the ground of being from which our physical world emerges. They describe light that doesn't come from any source, spaces that are somehow larger on the inside than the outside, encounters with presences or beings that communicate directly with their minds. And when they come back, they struggle to find words for what they experienced, because language evolved to describe the physical world, and fails when applied to experiences outside that framework. The Bible is full of these moments. Ezekiel sees the heavens opened and beholds visions of God. Isaiah sees the Lord sitting on a throne with the train of his robe filling the temple. Stephen looks up and sees heaven opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. John, on Patmos, sees a door standing open in heaven, and a voice calls him to come up. These aren't described as dreams or allegories. They're described as perceptions of something real, something that exists but that normally remains hidden. And the language used is always about opening, about barriers temporarily dissolving, about being able to see what was there all along. What if the flaming sword that guards Eden isn't a weapon, but exactly this kind of barrier, not a physical object, but a frequency boundary, a dimensional membrane that keeps the fallen world frequency separated from the Eden frequency? The Hebrew word used in Genesis, lahat, means not just flame, but also to shine or to flash, and the word for turning, mithapeket, comes from a root meaning to overturn or transform, to change something's essential nature. What if the ancient writer was trying to describe something rotating through dimensions he couldn't see, creating a barrier not through heat or sharpness, but through constant transformation of the space it occupies, making it impossible for anything in one state to cross into another state, because the boundary itself is always shifting, always changing, always one step ahead of any attempt to breach it. Modern physics talks about phase transitions, moments when matter changes from one state to another, ice to water to steam, and these transitions require energy and create boundaries. You can't be ice and water simultaneously in the same location at the same temperature. What if the flaming sword is a phase boundary, a line between states of reality that can't coexist, and crossing it would require a transformation so fundamental that it would change what you are at the most basic level? And here's the truly stunning part, the piece that makes skeptics uncomfortable and believers wonder if science is finally catching up to Scripture. If Eden exists in a parallel dimension or quantum state, that would explain why the cherubim are still guarding it after thousands of years. They're not protecting ruins or memories. They're maintaining the integrity of the dimensional separation. They're ensuring that the two realities don't bleed into each other and corrupt both. Because if the frequency barrier broke down, if someone in our fallen state managed to cross into Eden, they wouldn't find paradise. They'd destroy it by their very presence. They'd bring corruption into perfection, like a drop of ink in pure water. The cherubim aren't keeping us out to be cruel. They're keeping us out because we're incompatible with what's there. Because in our current state, we're like a virus that would infect and destroy the thing we're trying to reach. And they're also keeping Eden in, preventing its perfection from leaking into our dimension prematurely, before the time when God will unite heaven and earth in the new creation described in Revelation. This explains something that's puzzled scholars for centuries, why so many people throughout history have claimed to see Eden or catch glimpses of paradise, and why these experiences always have the same characteristics: brief, overwhelming, often induced by extreme states like near death or deep prayer or fasting, and always involving perception of something that seems more real than normal reality. They weren't hallucinating, and they weren't lying. They were tuning in. Their consciousness briefly aligned with a different frequency. They caught a glimpse through the barrier, and what they saw was real, just not accessible through normal means. The book of 2nd Baruch describes the prophet seeing the place where Adam was, and the tree that will blossom in the age to come. Saint Macarius in the Egyptian desert sees an angel guarding the entrance to Adam's garden. Saint Brendan sails to an island with a river that divides into 4, and is told, "This is the earthly paradise." Alexander the Great reaches gates that shine with inner light, and a voice tells him, "No mortal enters here until the appointed time." Different centuries, different cultures, different religious frameworks, but the same core experience. A perfect garden that still exists, but can't be reached, guarded, real, waiting. If this theory is true, and I'm not saying it definitely is, but if it's true, then it changes everything about how we understand the fall, and the exile, and the long story of redemption. It means Eden isn't behind us, it's beside us, occupying the same space but in a different dimension. And the journey back isn't through geography or archaeology or any physical search. It's through transformation, through becoming the kind of beings who can exist at that frequency, through purification and sanctification, and whatever process it takes to make us compatible with paradise again. It means the cherubim are waiting not just to keep us out, but to let us in when we're ready, when we've been changed enough that our presence won't corrupt what they're guarding. It means that every spiritual practice that tries to quiet the mind and open perception might be an attempt, conscious or unconscious, to tune the dial of consciousness toward the frequency where Eden still broadcasts. And it means that the promise of return isn't about God creating something new, but about us being transformed enough to perceive and enter what's been there all along. Take a breath here, let this settle, because I know it's a lot. If your mind is reeling, if you're feeling that vertigo of paradigm shift, that's normal. That's what happens when you glimpse the possibility that reality is vastly larger and stranger than you were taught. But stay with me, because if this is even partially true, if Eden really does exist in some parallel state or hidden dimension, then the next question is obvious. Has anyone actually been there? Has anyone crossed that barrier and come back to tell us what they saw? The answer is yes. And their testimonies are remarkably consistent across centuries and continents and completely different religious traditions. And in the next chapter, we're going to examine their accounts and ask whether they're all describing the same place, and whether that place might still be exactly where it always was, just one frequency away from where you're sitting right now. The silence deepens, the mystery continues, and we're about to meet the witnesses. Chapter 4. The Witnesses, those who claim to have seen Eden. You're sitting in an archive of ancient manuscripts illuminated by candles because the electric lights were turned off hours ago. The smell of old parchment and beeswax thick in the air, shadows dancing on stone walls that have stood for 800 years. Before you, on a table worn smooth by centuries of scholars, are 7 accounts. 7 testimonies written by 7 different people, separated by oceans and centuries, and completely different cultures. People who never met each other, never read each other's words, never coordinated their stories. Yet as you read them, one by one, your hands trembling slightly in the candlelight, you notice something that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They're all describing the same thing. A garden beyond reach, guarded by a being of light, radiating perfection. Impossible to enter, but undeniably real. You expect fantasy when you open these texts. You expect the wild exaggerations of legend, or the wishful thinking of people desperate to believe paradise still exists somewhere. But what you find instead is precise, measured, sober. The testimony of people who saw something they couldn't explain, and who risked their reputations to record it anyway. These weren't dreamers or poets spinning tales to entertain children. They were prophets and monks, and even a conquering emperor. Serious people with everything to lose and nothing to gain from lying about visions of a lost garden. The question that haunts you as you read is simple and terrible. Were they all wrong? Victims of mass delusion or shared mythology? Or were they all right? Witnesses to something that exists outside the normal boundaries of human experience. Let's start with one of the oldest testimonies, from a Jewish prophet writing in the 2nd century, after the destruction of Jerusalem left his people scattered and questioning everything they thought they knew about God's promises. The text is called the Apocalypse of Baruch, sometimes called Second Baruch, to distinguish it from other works attributed to the same prophet. And in it, Baruch describes being taken in vision to see the place where Adam dwelt before he transgressed the commandment. He's grieving when this vision comes, questioning God about why the righteous suffer, and why the temple was destroyed, and whether the promises to Abraham mean anything if Jerusalem is ash and ruins. And in response, he's shown something that changes his entire perspective. Baruch describes a place of light that doesn't come from the sun or moon or stars. Light that emanates from the ground itself, and from the trees, and from the air, as though everything there is generating its own radiance from within. He sees the tree of life, still standing, still bearing fruit, its leaves so green they almost hurt to look at. And he understands without being told that this tree has been producing fruit continuously for thousands of years, with no one to eat it. Waiting. An angel stands with him as he watches, and the angel tells him, "This is preserved for the righteous in the age to come, for those who have kept the way and not turned aside." And Baruch understands that what he's seeing isn't a memory or a ghost of the past, but a present reality, a place that exists right now in some dimension he normally can't perceive. What's striking about Baruch's account is how he describes the experience of getting there. He doesn't walk to it or sail to it or climb a mountain to find it. He's brought in spirit. His body remains in one place, while his consciousness, or soul, or whatever part of him perceives, travels to another location that doesn't have coordinates in normal space. He describes it as being caught up, and then suddenly being there. No journey in between, no sense of distance traveled, just a transition from one state of awareness to another. And when he returns, when the vision ends and he's back in his body in the ruins of Jerusalem, he struggles to find words for what he's experienced. He keeps saying, "I saw," and "I beheld," but also acknowledging that what he saw was not as one sees with the eyes of the flesh, but with some other mode of perception that humans don't normally use. You try to imagine Baruch's feelings during this experience, grief transforming into awe, despair giving way to hope, because he's been shown that what was lost isn't destroyed, only hidden, that paradise isn't gone but preserved, waiting for the moment when the righteous will be allowed to enter. It's not comfort exactly, because he can't go there now, can't eat that fruit or rest in that shade, but it's promise. It's assurance that the story isn't over. 3 centuries later, in the deserts of Egypt, one of the great desert fathers named Macarius has an experience that echoes Baruch's in disturbing detail. Macarius has lived in the Sketis desert for 40 years by the time this happens. 40 years of prayer and fasting and solitude. 40 years of spiritual discipline so intense that other monks travel from across the Christian world to sit at his feet and learn from him. One night, during prayer, he receives a vision of what he later describes as Adam's garden, and, in his account preserved in Coptic Orthodox tradition, he sees a place of such overwhelming beauty that he weeps for 3 days afterward, not from sadness, but from the pain of having glimpsed perfection and then returning to the broken world. At the entrance to this garden stands an angel with a sword that blazes with light so intense Macarius can't look directly at it, exactly as Genesis describes, and the angel doesn't speak or threaten, but simply stands watch with a presence that communicates absolute refusal. Macarius understands without being told that he cannot enter, not because he's being punished, but because he's not ready. Because even after 40 years of purification, he's still not pure enough to cross that threshold without being consumed by what's on the other side. What's fascinating about Macarius's testimony is how he describes the feeling of approaching the garden. He talks about overwhelming holiness that presses against him like physical weight, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to think, difficult to maintain his sense of self. He says it's like approaching a flame that doesn't burn with heat, but with purity, and the closer you get, the more aware you become of everything in you that isn't pure, every selfish thought and petty anger and moment of pride burning away in that light until you're left raw and exposed and completely unable to take another step. The angel doesn't push him back. The garden itself pushes him back, or rather his own incompatibility with that level of holiness prevents him from going further. Macarius spends the rest of his life teaching that Eden still exists between earth and heaven. Not destroyed and not simply metaphorical, but real and preserved, waiting for the day when human beings will be transformed enough to enter without being destroyed by the encounter. He tells his students that the work of the spiritual life is preparation for that moment, that every prayer and every fast and every act of love is another step toward becoming someone who could stand in that garden and not burst into flames from the sheer contrast between the purity there and the corruption still clinging to you. 6 centuries after Christ, an Irish monk named Brendan set sail into the Atlantic with a crew of fellow monks, searching for what he calls the land of promise of the saints. And what happens next becomes one of the most famous voyage narratives in medieval literature. For 7 years, they sail west into unknown waters, encountering islands that seem pulled from dreams, an island where birds sing hymns in human voices, an island with a crystal pillar rising from the sea, an island that turns out to be the back of a whale, and finally they come to an island unlike any other. Brendan describes a garden watered by a river that flows from the center and divides into 4 branches, exactly as Genesis describes Eden's geography. And the light there doesn't come from the sun, but seems to be generated by the place itself, illuminating without shadows, warm without heat. The trees bear fruit continuously, not in seasons, but always, and the air carries a fragrance that makes his crew weep with longing for something they can't name. A figure that Brendan calls a shining youth meets them at the shore and tells them, "This is the land you have sought, but you cannot enter further, for this is the earthly paradise, guarded until the end of time, and you must return to your own country to die." Brendan is allowed to see the garden, to smell its air and hear its waters and witness its beauty, but not to enter, not to stay. And when he asks why, the youth tells him, "Because the time has not yet come. Because what was closed to Adam must remain closed until the one who opens what is shut and shuts what is open declares otherwise." Brendan and his monks spend 40 days on the shore of this island, close enough to see into the garden but unable to cross the boundary, and then they sail home to Ireland, where Brendan spends his remaining years insisting to anyone who will listen that he reached the edge of Eden, that paradise is real, that it exists somewhere west beyond the known world, still perfect, still guarded, still waiting. Many scholars think Brendan actually reached Iceland or Newfoundland and interpreted what he found through the lens of his expectations. But how do you explain the river that splits into four, or the light with no source, or the fruit that grows out of season, or the guardian who speaks of Adam and the end of time? The most unexpected testimony comes from Alexander the Great, or rather from the legendary accounts of his conquests called the Alexandrides that circulated widely in Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, and Greek versions in the centuries after his death. After conquering the known world, after defeating Persia and reaching India, after running out of kingdoms to conquer, Alexander supposedly turned his army east beyond the edge of the maps, searching for the water of life that would grant him the immortality he craved. The legends say he reached a place where mountains ended in walls so high they disappeared into clouds, and carved into these mountains were gates of impossible size, perfectly fitted stones that showed no seam or mortar. The gates glowed with inner light, though no fires burned nearby, and from beyond them came a fragrance so beautiful that Alexander's hardest soldiers wept like children, not from sadness, but from a longing they'd never felt before and couldn't describe. Alexander ordered the gates opened, and his engineers tried every tool and technique they knew. But the gates wouldn't move, wouldn't even vibrate or echo when struck, as though they were made of something denser than stone, or existed partially in some dimension where force had no effect. A voice came from beyond the gates. The legends disagree on whether it was a man's voice or something else, something that used human language but wasn't human. And it said, "You have conquered the world, but you cannot conquer this. Turn back, for no mortal enters here until the appointed time." Alexander demanded entry, threatened, pleaded, offered treasures, but the voice only repeated the same message. And finally, someone pushed through a small opening in the gates, a stone about the size of a man's eye. The legends say this stone had a strange property. It outweighed all the gold Alexander had taken from all the cities he'd conquered. But when someone covered it with dust, it weighed nothing. And the wise men with Alexander understood this as a riddle about mortality and vanity, about how human ambition weighs heavier than all the treasures of earth until death covers it, and it becomes nothing. Some dismiss this entire story as legend, as Eastern fable with no historical basis. But it appears in too many different sources that don't depend on each other, in Persian texts and Hebrew texts and Greek texts, and they all agree on the essential details. Gates that glow, fragrance that causes weeping, a voice that refuses entry, a gift that teaches humility. What are we to make of these testimonies? 4 witnesses separated by centuries and continents, a Jewish prophet in the 2nd century, a Christian monk in the 4th, an Irish sailor in the 6th, a Macedonian emperor in the 4th century before Christ. None of them knew the other's stories, none of them collaborated or coordinated. They came from different religious traditions with different expectations about what paradise would look like. Yet they all describe the same core elements: a garden of impossible beauty, light that doesn't come from normal sources, a guardian or barrier that prevents entry, and most importantly, the sense that this place isn't a memory or a vision of something that used to exist, but a present reality, something that's still there right now, accessible to perception under certain conditions, but not accessible to the body. Not yet. The consistency is either remarkable coincidence, or it's evidence that they all encountered the same thing, that they all found ways to tune their perception to the frequency where Eden still broadcasts. And what they saw wasn't imagination or wish fulfillment, but genuine perception of something real that exists beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. If you're wondering whether these accounts are credible, you're not alone. Historians have debated them for centuries, skeptics dismissing them as mythology, and believers treating them as literal truth, and most scholars landing somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, where you can't prove they're true, but you also can't quite explain them away. But here's what we know beyond dispute. These people staked their reputations on what they reported. Baruch was a respected prophet whose other writings show careful thought and theological sophistication. Macarius was one of the most revered spiritual teachers of his era, whose wisdom attracted students from across the Christian world. Brendan was a serious monk who founded monasteries, and whose navigational knowledge was genuine enough that some historians think Irish monks reached America centuries before Columbus. They had nothing to gain from lying about visions of paradise, and everything to lose: reputation and credibility, and the trust of the communities they served. Yet they all chose to record these experiences anyway. They all decided that what they'd seen was important enough to risk being dismissed as madmen or fabulists. And they're not the only ones. There are dozens of similar accounts scattered through Jewish mysticism and Christian hagiography and Islamic tradition. Brief mentions of holy men who saw the garden that is kept for the righteous, or who were taken up to see the place of the first man. Consistent threads woven through different tapestries that suggest something real underneath the varying details and cultural interpretations. Maybe the question isn't whether they saw what they claimed to see. Maybe the question is why they were shown it at all. What purpose these glimpses serve, whether they're meant to be witnesses or reminders or promises that what was lost hasn't been destroyed but preserved. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that's hardest to dismiss once you've considered it seriously, maybe they simply found themselves in states of consciousness where the barrier between dimensions grew thin enough to perceive through, where their awareness briefly aligned with the frequency where Eden exists, and they caught a glimpse of what's been there all along, just beyond the edge of normal perception, waiting for the day when the frequency barrier drops completely and what's been hidden becomes visible to everyone. The silence grows heavier now, the weight of testimony and mystery pressing down, and we're about to turn a corner in this story, because if Eden exists, and if people throughout history have caught glimpses of it, then the next question is obvious and unavoidable. Why can't we go there now? What's the test we're failing? What would it take to become someone who could cross that boundary and enter the garden that still waits on the other side? Stay close, because the next chapter explores the most challenging idea yet, that Eden isn't just hidden, but locked, and we're the ones holding the key. Chapter 5. The Spiritual Test. Eden as Proving Ground. You're standing in a cathedral so old its foundation stones were laid before the nation around it existed, before the language you speak was invented, before the calendar changed from Julian to Gregorian and added days that never happened. The air is thick with incense accumulated over centuries, prayers absorbed into limestone walls, the breath of 10,000 pilgrims who came seeking something they couldn't name. Above you, in stained glass that predates the printing press, a window depicts the cherubim with their flaming swords blazing red and gold and orange, their faces stern and beautiful and terrible, their wings spread to block a gate that glows green behind them like emerald fire. You've been staring at this window for 20 minutes, long enough that the tour group moved on without you, long enough that the light has shifted and the colors have changed. And as you stand there, a thought strikes you with the force of revelation, a connection forming that reorganizes everything you thought you understood. What if the cherubim aren't just keeping humans out of Eden? What if they're waiting for the right humans to be ready to enter? What if the sword isn't a weapon of exclusion, but a test of purification? What if all of human history, every struggle and choice and moment of moral decision, is one long examination, and Eden is still there at the end of it, the final chamber that opens only when we pass? Every spiritual tradition speaks of trials, of purifications, of stages of initiation that candidates must complete before entering sacred spaces or receiving secret knowledge. In ancient mystery religions, you couldn't just walk into the inner temple. You had to prove yourself worthy through months or years of preparation, fasting and study and tests of character that filtered out those who weren't ready. The temple in Jerusalem had concentric circles of holiness. Outer courts where anyone could enter, inner courts for Jews only, still more restricted areas for priests, and at the very center, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go, and only once a year after elaborate purification rituals. Because the presence of God concentrated there was so intense that approaching it in the wrong state would kill you instantly. The book of Hebrews makes this explicit. It says, "The Holy Spirit was showing by this that the way into the most holy place had not yet been disclosed as long as the first tabernacle was still functioning," meaning the restricted access wasn't arbitrary or cruel, but necessary. The barrier wasn't punishment, but protection. What if Eden operates the same way, not destroyed and not simply sealed, but restricted until we meet the requirements, until we become the kind of beings who can exist in that environment without being destroyed by the exposure or destroying it by our presence? The book of Revelation gives us a clue that most readers pass over without noticing the implications. It says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, that they may have the right to the tree of life, and may go through the gates into the city." Notice the language. Not, "Blessed are those who will receive a new tree," or "Blessed are those who will enter a replica of paradise," but "that they may have the right to the tree." Present tense, as though the tree still exists, and what's needed isn't for God to recreate it, but for humans to become pure enough to approach it. The imagery is of washing robes, of purification, of removing stains and corruption until what remains is clean enough to enter a space of absolute holiness. This isn't about being good enough to earn salvation. Christian theology is clear that salvation is gift, not achievement, but it is about being transformed enough to survive in the presence of unfiltered divine holiness, about becoming compatible with an environment that would consume anything still marked by corruption. The role of the cherubim in this framework transforms from prison guards to threshold guardians, not jailers keeping people in cells, but gatekeepers, ensuring that no one enters who isn't prepared for what they'll encounter. In mystical traditions across cultures, you find this archetype, the guardian at the gate, who asks the riddle, or demands the password, or tests the seeker's worthiness. And the point is never arbitrary exclusion, but appropriate filtering, making sure that only those who can handle what lies beyond are allowed through. The cherubim's job is to ensure no one enters Eden who isn't ready, because entering paradise in a state of impurity might not be privilege, but death, might not be reward, but destruction. Remember what happened to Uzzah in 2 Samuel chapter 6, when he reached out to steady the Ark of the Covenant. He touched it with good intentions, trying to keep it from falling, and he died instantly, struck down not by God's anger, but by the incompatibility between his unclean state and the concentrated holiness of the ark. The text doesn't say God was offended or punished him, it says he died, simply ceased, as though touching that level of holiness in an unprepared state was like touching a live wire carrying more voltage than a human body can survive. Holiness in the biblical framework isn't passive or safe or gentle. It's active and dangerous, and consuming to anything that isn't pure. Eden might be the same, a place so saturated with divine presence, so charged with the original perfection of creation, that approaching it in our current state wouldn't be like coming home, but like stepping into a furnace. We'd be burned away not by punishment, but by exposure to what we were meant to be, and are no longer. The cherubim maintain the boundary, not to keep us from joy, but to keep us from annihilation. They're protecting us as much as they're protecting the garden, ensuring the barrier stays in place until the day when we've been transformed enough that crossing it won't destroy us. This reframes the entire narrative of exile. It's not about being locked out forever, but about being kept out until we're ready. Not about permanent exclusion, but about mandatory preparation. And the length of that preparation is up to us. It lasts as long as it takes for humanity to become collectively what we were originally meant to be. Multiple religious traditions describe this process of preparation, using different language but pointing toward the same transformation. Eastern Orthodox Christianity talks about theosis, the process of becoming by grace what God is by nature, a gradual divinization of the human person through prayer and sacrament and ascetic practice that takes a lifetime or longer. Catholic theology describes purgatory, a state after death where the final stains of sin are burned away and the soul is prepared for the vision of God that would be unbearable to encounter while still carrying attachments to corruption. Jewish mysticism speaks of Gehenna, a maximum 12-month period after death where the soul is purified through a process that's described variously as fire or washing or grinding, painful but ultimately merciful, removing what doesn't belong so that what remains can enter Gan Eden, the garden preserved for the righteous. Islam describes stages of paradise corresponding to stages of purity achieved in life, higher gardens for those who achieved higher levels of submission to God's will, suggesting that heaven itself has degrees, and not everyone enters the same level. Different vocabulary, different theological frameworks, but the same core insight. You have to be transformed to enter. You can't approach ultimate holiness carrying ultimate corruption. Something has to give, and what gives is the corruption, burned away or washed away or ground away, until what remains is compatible with paradise. But here's where it gets fascinating, where the theory shifts from being about individual transformation to being about cosmic restoration. Some mystical traditions teach that Eden isn't static, that the garden isn't frozen in time, waiting unchanged for our return, but that it's growing, expanding, preparing itself to receive the influx of redeemed humanity that will eventually enter. The book of Revelation describes the New Jerusalem as massive, 12,000 stadia in each direction, that's 1,400 miles on each side, a cube of city garden that could contain multiple nations, and at its center, the river of life flows and the tree of life grows. Not a single tree, but a presence on both sides of the river bearing 12 kinds of fruit, with leaves for healing the nations. This isn't the small garden of Genesis with 2 people. This is paradise scaled up to accommodate multitudes. And some interpreters believe this represents Eden's final form, what it's been becoming during all the centuries of human exile, expanding and preparing, like a city making ready for a great festival, constructing dwelling places for guests who will arrive when the time is right. This expanding Eden model suggests that human history isn't meaningless wandering, but purposeful preparation. Every act of goodness adding somehow to the garden's growth. Every soul that's purified becoming a future citizen whose place is being prepared. And when the number is complete, when enough are ready, when the garden has expanded to its full intended size, then the cherubim will step aside. Not because the rules changed, or because God got soft, or because the standard lowered, but because we finally met it. Because enough of humanity transformed into beings compatible with paradise that the barrier can drop and the 2 realities can merge. The cherubim aren't waiting to be convinced to let us in. They're waiting for us to become people they can let in without violating their mandate to protect the holiness of what they guard. Maybe every temptation you resist is a key being cut. Every act of selfless love is a tumbler falling into place. Every time you choose light over darkness, or truth over comfort, or mercy over revenge, you're not just being good, you're picking the lock on the gate you've been standing before your whole life without realizing it. What if the cruelest part of the fall wasn't being cast out of Eden, but having to work your way back, not through shortcuts or secret knowledge or magical rituals, but through the slow, painful work of becoming someone worthy to return? Not worthy in the sense of earning it, because Scripture is clear that grace is gift, but worthy in the sense of being capable of surviving it, being pure enough that exposure to perfection won't destroy you. Every spiritual practice across every tradition is trying to accomplish the same thing, whether it calls itself prayer or meditation or fasting or submission or contemplation. It's all attempting to quiet the noise of the corrupted self, to tune perception away from the fallen frequency and toward the original frequency where Eden still broadcasts. The Desert Fathers who went into the Egyptian wilderness for 40 years, the Buddhist monks who meditate until they achieve states of consciousness beyond normal human experience, the Sufi mystics who whirl until the boundaries of self dissolve, the Christian contemplatives who pray until they enter silence deeper than the absence of sound. They're all trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to tune the dial of awareness toward the station where paradise can be perceived. And maybe that's why the guards are still there after thousands of years. Maybe the cherubim are waiting not just to keep us out, but to welcome us in when we're finally ready. When we've transformed enough that our presence won't corrupt what they're guarding, and their presence won't consume what we are. Maybe the flaming sword isn't a threat, but a promise. Fire that will destroy the corruption but preserve the soul. A threshold that burns away what doesn't belong and allows through what does. Maybe crossing it won't feel like punishment, but like coming home. Like finally arriving at the place you've been homesick for your entire life, without knowing why or where it was. The cathedral bells begin to ring, pulling you out of your thoughts, and you realize you've been standing here staring at that stained glass window for over an hour, and something in you has shifted. You can't quite name it, but you feel different, as though you've been carrying a weight you didn't know was there, and it's lighter now, not gone, but bearable. You walk toward the door, and the light follows you, red and gold and green from the window washing over you like a blessing. And as you step back out into the world, you carry with you a question that won't stay quiet. What if Eden isn't waiting for God to open the gate, but for us to become people the gate can open for? What if the test isn't cosmic or arbitrary, but intimate and personal, and you're taking it right now, with every choice you make, with every thought you think, with every moment you decide who you're going to be? The path continues, and the next chapter will show you what's been promised about the gate opening, about when and how and who will be there when it finally does. Because the Bible doesn't leave us without answers about paradise regained. It's full of promises that the exile will end, that the garden will open, that what was lost will be found. And understanding those promises might change how you live every day until they come true. Chapter 6. The Promise of Return. When will Eden open again? You're standing at the edge of a river watching the sun rise, the water moving slowly beneath a sky that shifts from deep blue to violet to gold. And the sound of the current is the only sound in the world right now, steady and patient and unstoppable. Somewhere far downstream, this river will reach the sea, joining with other rivers in a delta you can't see from here, but you know exists, because all rivers eventually find their way to something larger than themselves. And somewhere farther than you can imagine, beyond the horizon of time and space and human understanding, all rivers lead back to one source, to the garden where a river flowed out to water paradise and divided into 4 headwaters that watered the whole earth. You think about everything we've explored together. The garden sealed after Adam and Eve left, guarded by beings of fire and light, possibly preserved in some parallel dimension where it continues in perfect condition, waiting for the frequency barrier to drop. and testimony after testimony from people across centuries who caught glimpses of it and came back changed. And now, standing here with the sunrise warming your face and the river singing its ancient song, a question rises in you that won't stay silent, that pushes up through your chest and into your throat like something alive. Will I ever see it? Will humanity ever return? Will the gates open in my lifetime, or my children's lifetime? Or is this exile permanent until the stars burn out and the universe goes cold? The Bible doesn't leave us without answers. In fact, Scripture is saturated with promises about restoration, about return, about paradise regained. And what's stunning is how often these prophecies describe not something completely new, but something that sounds exactly like Eden, as though what God plans for the future is a return to the beginning, but better. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a recovery of it, transformed and expanded and made permanent. Eden appears in Genesis chapter 2, and it reappears in Revelation chapter 22. The story comes full circle, like a snake eating its tail, or a river returning to its source. And between those two gardens lies the entire drama of human history, 4,000 years or 6,000 years, or however long it's been since the gate closed. All of it an exile that points toward homecoming. All of it a long journey that was always meant to end where it began. The question isn't whether we'll return. The promises are too clear and too consistent for that question to remain open. The question is when and how, and who will be there when it finally happens. Let's start with Isaiah, the prophet who lived in the 8th century before Christ, during a time when Israel was surrounded by enemies and split between the northern and southern kingdoms, and constantly under threat from Assyria and Babylon. Yet this man, in this desperate situation, received visions of a future so beautiful it defies everything common sense says is possible. Isaiah chapter 11 describes a world where the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. Which isn't just poetry or metaphor, but a description of Eden-like harmony, predators and prey existing together in peace the way they did before the fall introduced violence and fear into creation. Isaiah chapter 35 says, "The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing," describing wastelands becoming gardens, barren places erupting with life, exactly what Eden was, life so abundant it couldn't be contained. And then, in chapter 51, verse 3, God speaks directly about the connection. "For the Lord comforts Zion, He comforts all her waste places, and makes her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord." Notice the language. Not creates something similar to Eden, but makes her wilderness like Eden, as though Eden is the template, the pattern that will be imposed on broken creation when God restores what was lost. Isaiah ties all these images to what he calls the day of the Lord, a phrase that appears throughout the prophets, referring to a specific moment when God will intervene in human history to judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous, and establish His kingdom on earth in a way that's undeniable and permanent. Jewish interpretation of these passages centers on the Messianic age, the time when God's chosen king will reign from Jerusalem and restore Israel and bring the nations to worship the God of Abraham. A time when the promises to the patriarchs will be fulfilled, not partially, but completely. Christian interpretation sees this as either Christ's first coming, when He initiated the restoration process, or His second coming, when He'll complete it, or both. A two-stage restoration, where the spiritual dimension was accomplished at the cross, and the physical dimension awaits the return. But both traditions agree on this. Eden isn't just history, it's prophecy. What was in the beginning will be in the end. The garden that was closed will open again. And Isaiah is describing not nostalgia for the past, but certainty about the future. The book of Revelation takes Isaiah's vision and amplifies it to cosmic scale. The last 2 chapters of the Bible read like the first 2 chapters, but expanded and intensified and made eternal. As though John is seeing Eden 2.0, paradise not just restored, but upgraded, perfected in ways that the original garden only hinted at. Revelation chapter 21 opens with, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." And that word new in Greek is kainos, which doesn't mean brand new never existed before, but rather renewed, made new again, restored to original condition, or better. John sees a city descending from heaven, the New Jerusalem, and his description of it contains unmistakable echoes of Eden. In fact, you could argue that the whole vision is Eden transformed from garden into garden city. Nature and civilization finally integrated instead of opposed. The city is massive, 12,000 stadia in each direction, according to chapter 21, verse 16. That's roughly 1,400 miles, forming a perfect cube. And some interpreters think this is literal, while others think it's symbolic of perfection. But either way, the scale is important. This isn't a small garden for 2 people. This is paradise expanded to contain nations, multitudes, everyone who washed their robes and entered through the gates. And the light in this city comes from the same source as the light in Eden. Revelation 21 verse 23 says, "The city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb," which matches how Eden's light was described by those who glimpsed it, not from celestial bodies, but from the presence of God himself, radiating through everything. Then in chapter 22, John sees the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. And this is clearly the same river that flowed through Eden to water the garden, now flowing through the New Jerusalem, suggesting continuity, not replacement, suggesting that what existed in the beginning was preserved and now returns. On each side of the river stands the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And this detail is crucial, because it answers the question of what happened to the tree of life after Eden was sealed. It was preserved, it continued growing, it kept producing fruit for thousands of years with no one to eat it, waiting for this moment when access would be restored. Revelation 22 verse 3 adds something that should make you weep if you understand what it means. No longer will there be any curse, the curse from Genesis chapter 3, the curse of thorns and pain and death and exile. That curse is lifted, removed, erased, as though the entire history of human suffering was a parenthesis in the middle of a sentence, and now we're back to the main text. And verse 14 says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life, and that they may enter the city by the gates." There's that word right again. Permission, authorization. The privilege that was revoked in Genesis is restored in Revelation. The tree that was guarded is now accessible. The fruit that Adam couldn't eat after the fall will be eaten by his descendants who persevered through the long exile. This is Eden not as it was, but as it was always meant to become. The garden was never supposed to stay small and pristine with just 2 people. It was supposed to grow and fill the earth, and humanity was supposed to spread the boundaries of paradise until the whole world became the garden. But we took a 4,000-year detour through violence and empires and exile before arriving at the destination that should have been reached in the beginning. Jewish eschatology approaches the same destination from a slightly different angle, but arrives at conclusions that overlap significantly with the Christian vision. The concept of Olam Haba, the world to come, isn't about souls floating in clouds playing harps. It's about a physical renewed earth, where the righteous will live in bodies, eating and drinking, and experiencing joy in ways that our current limited existence only hints at. The Messianic age in Jewish thought involves the Messiah gathering the scattered exiles of Israel, rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, establishing peace among the nations, and most importantly for our purposes, restoring the world to its Edenic state. Maimonides, writing in the Mishneh Torah, says, "In the Messianic era there will be neither famine nor war, neither envy nor strife, for good things will flow in abundance, and all delights will be as freely available as dust. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God," which sounds like a description of Eden, where provision was automatic and the primary activity was walking with God in the cool of the day. The Talmud contains passages about Gan Eden existing on two levels: an upper Gan Eden, where righteous souls go after death to await resurrection, and a lower Gan Eden, which is the physical garden that will be restored on earth when the Messiah comes, suggesting that what was hidden will be revealed, what was in heaven will descend to earth. The separation between the two realms will end. Both traditions, Jewish and Christian, refuse to set specific dates for when this restoration will happen. Jesus himself said in the Gospels that, "Concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only," which suggests that the timing is deliberately hidden, that the when is less important than the certainty that it will happen. Jewish tradition teaches that the Messiah could come in any generation, that every generation should live as though they might be the one to see redemption, that the work of tikkun olam, repairing the world, brings the day closer, but the final timing remains in God's hands. Christian theology similarly emphasizes readiness over prediction. The parable of the 10 virgins and the thief in the night, and all the passages about watching and being prepared, suggest that the second coming could happen at any moment. But trying to calculate the date is futile and misses the point. What both traditions agree on absolutely is this: Eden will return, humanity will be restored, creation will be healed, the garden that was closed will open, and those who've waited and worked and longed will finally be able to enter. Here's what strikes me about all these prophecies as I stand by this river watching the sun climb higher and the light change from gold to white. None of them describe Eden as lost forever or destroyed beyond recovery. None of them treat paradise as a memory we need to get over and move past. All of them treat it as dormant, waiting, preparing, like a seed buried in winter that looks dead but is actually gathering strength for spring. The Bible begins in a garden and ends in a garden city, and between Genesis and Revelation is the long, painful story of exile. But exile always implies return. You can't be exiled from a place that no longer exists. The very fact that we use the word exile for the human condition suggests that there's a home we're separated from, and that separation isn't permanent. Paradise isn't behind us, it's ahead of us. Not a memory, but a promise. Not what we lost, but what we're becoming worthy to receive. And every day we live in this broken world is another day closer to the moment when the cherubim will lower their swords and the gates will open, and we'll walk back into the place we've been homesick for since the day Adam took his last look over his shoulder and stepped beyond the boundary. So when will it happen? When will the gates reopen and the exile end? The honest answer is, no one knows the day or hour. But every spiritual tradition agrees that preparation matters, that the wait isn't passive but active, that we're not just waiting for Eden, but becoming the kind of people who can live in Eden. The wait might be tomorrow, or 1,000 years from tomorrow, but the certainty is that it will happen. The promise is made, and God doesn't break promises. And in the meantime, we live between the garden that was and the garden that will be, carrying the memory forward and the hope backward until they meet in the present moment and transform how we see everything. If you're still listening, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey from the moment Adam left to the moment we'll return, then you're ready for the final chapter, the one that asks the hardest question and offers the most challenging answer. What does all of this mean for you personally today? How do you live in a world where paradise is both lost and promised? And what are you supposed to do with the longing that won't let you rest until you're home? Chapter 7. Living Between Edens. What this means for you. You're back where we started, standing at the edge of that ancient forest where the air smells different and the light bends in ways that make no sense. But now you see it differently. Now you understand what you're looking at. You've walked through theories about what happened to Eden after humanity left. You've examined testimonies from prophets and monks and explorers who claimed they glimpsed it. You've considered the possibility that it exists in some parallel dimension, separated from us not by distance, but by frequency. You've explored the idea that the exile is a test we're all taking, whether we know it or not. And you've heard the promises that one day the gate will open, and the long journey home will end. And now you're left with the only question that really matters, the one that transforms all this ancient history and mystical speculation and prophetic vision into something immediate and personal and unavoidable. What do I do with this? How does knowing about Eden change how I live today, right now, in this moment? You take a breath, and the air feels different, not because the air changed, but because you did. You're aware, perhaps for the first time, that you're living in the in-between, suspended between the garden that was and the garden that will be. And that awareness shifts something fundamental in how you see everything around you. Most people live their entire lives never thinking about Eden. They dismiss it as ancient mythology or children's stories or religious doctrine that has no relevance to the practical business of getting through the day, paying bills and raising kids, and trying to find some measure of happiness before the clock runs out. But what if it's the most relevant story ever told? What if every longing you've ever felt, every moment of dissatisfaction, every sense that something's missing even when everything's going well, what if all of that is your soul remembering Eden and reaching for it across the centuries? There's a German word that C.S. Lewis loved, Sehnsucht, which means an inconsolable longing, a yearning for something you can't quite name. And Lewis argued that this feeling is universal, that every human being experiences it, whether they have vocabulary for it or not. It's that ache you feel when you see a sunset so beautiful it almost hurts, when the beauty is too much to hold and you want to weep, but you don't know why. It's that homesickness for a place you've never been, that sense when you hear certain music or smell certain smells, or see certain landscapes, that you're remembering something from before you were born. It's that restlessness that no achievement satisfies for more than a moment, that gnawing suspicion that you're supposed to be somewhere else, living some other kind of life, experiencing some other kind of reality that this one only hints at. Psychologists call it existential anxiety. Philosophers call it alienation. Poets call it the wound that never heals. But what if it's simpler than all those sophisticated labels? What if it's just memory? Not personal memory, because none of us were in Eden, but genetic memory, spiritual memory, the collective memory of the species that once knew paradise and lost it, and has been trying to find the way back ever since. Every religion and mythology speaks of a golden age at the beginning of time. Hindus describe Satya Yuga, when humans lived for thousands of years and Dharma was perfect. Greeks told stories about the age of Kronos, when the earth gave fruit without labor and death was only sleep. Norse legends remember the time before Ragnarok, when the world tree stood unbroken and gods and humans walked together in harmony. Different names, different details, different gods and different trees, but the same story underneath all of them. We came from somewhere better. We lost it through some catastrophe or choice or cosmic shift, and we've been trying to get back ever since. Maybe that longing isn't a defect in us. Maybe it's a compass pointing toward true north, reminding us that we were made for something more than what we see, that this world of violence and disease and death and loss isn't the end of the story, but the middle, the long exile between the home we left and the home we're heading toward. The question is how you respond to that longing, because you can't unfeel it once you're aware of it. You can't go back to sleepwalking through life, pretending that this is all there is. Most people try to fill the Eden-shaped hole with things that don't fit, money and success and relationships and pleasure and power, and they wonder why they're still empty, why the achievement of every goal just reveals another goal beyond it, why satisfaction lasts about 5 minutes before the restlessness returns. Some deny the longing entirely. They say it's an evolutionary accident, or a side effect of consciousness, or a trick the brain plays. They suppress it and distract themselves, and try to accept that this is all there is, atoms and void, and then nothing. And if you can just stop wanting more, you'll find peace in what's available. But even the most hardcore materialists admit they feel it. They just don't know what to call it, or how to make sense of it in a universe without meaning. Others feel the longing and conclude it's cruel, that existence itself is a trap, that being given the capacity to yearn for perfection while living in a broken world is the ultimate cosmic joke. And this leads to nihilism, bitterness, resentment, a life spent angry at the universe for promising something it won't deliver. Then there are those who try to build Eden themselves, who believe that if we just get the politics right, or the technology right, or the social structures right, we can recreate paradise through human effort. And every utopian ideology from communism to techno-futurism follows this pattern, promising heaven on earth through revolution or innovation or social engineering. And every single one has failed, often catastrophically, often with mountains of corpses marking the gap between the vision and the reality. Because Eden can't be built from the outside, it can only be returned to. It can only be received as gift, not achieved as project. But there's a fourth option, the hardest and the truest, and the one that actually works even though it takes a lifetime or longer. Acknowledge the longing, honor it. Let it pull you forward not by trying to recreate what was lost, but by becoming someone who could live in it if it returned. This is the path of saints and mystics and seekers across every tradition, a lifelong journey of purification and transformation, not ignoring the world but engaging with it while holding it lightly, not pretending this is home but not despising it either, loving people and doing good work and creating beauty while understanding that all of it is temporary, all of it is preparation, all of it is the long education that makes you ready for what comes next. Here's something beautiful that I want you to hold on to. Eden leaves clues, moments when the veil grows thin and you catch a glimpse of what's on the other side, brief flashes when the frequency shifts just enough that you perceive something beyond the normal bandwidth of human awareness. A perfect morning when the light slants through trees in a way that makes you stop breathing, a moment of deep connection with someone you love when time seems to slow and you're both present in a way that rarely happens. The first time you hold your child and feel a love so fierce it terrifies you. The silence after meditation, when your mind finally stops its constant chattering and you hear something underneath the noise, music that moves you to tears for no logical reason. Beauty that feels like memory even though you've never seen it before. These moments aren't Eden, but they're echoes of it, like hearing a song from far away and straining to remember the lyrics, like catching a scent that transports you to a time and place you can't quite locate. Mystics call these thin places, locations or moments when heaven and earth overlap, when the membrane between dimensions becomes permeable and you get a glimpse through the barrier. And they happen more often than you think if you're paying attention, if you're not so distracted by the noise of modern life that you miss the whispers. You can't force these moments, but you can cultivate readiness for them. You can create conditions where they're more likely to occur, even though they remain ultimately gift, ultimately grace. Through silence, because Eden was quiet, the only sounds were water and wind, and the voice of God in the cool of the day. So cultivating silence in your life, actual physical silence where you turn off the screens and the music and the constant input, creates space for perception beyond the normal. Through simplicity, because Eden was uncluttered, every object had purpose, and nothing was wasted or excessive or designed to impress. So simplifying your life, removing the accumulation of stuff that buries you, clearing physical and mental space, aligns you more closely with paradise. Through gratitude, because Eden was gift, nothing was earned or deserved or achieved, everything was provided freely by a generous creator. So practicing gratitude for what you have, instead of obsessing over what you lack, trains your perception toward abundance instead of scarcity. Through service, because Eden was others-focused, Adam's job was to tend the garden, not for his own benefit, but for the glory of God and the flourishing of creation. So living for something beyond yourself, contributing to the healing and growth of others, aligns your purposes with the original design. These practices don't create Eden. They don't earn you entry or shorten the exile or manipulate God into opening the gates early. But they attune you to the frequency where Eden broadcasts. They tune your perception like adjusting a radio dial until the signal comes through clear. And the purpose of these glimpses, these thin moments when you catch the scent of paradise, is to remind you that it's real, to give you proof that your longing isn't delusional, to sustain you through the hard days when life feels like nothing but exile and you wonder if the promises are true. On the days when the world is too heavy, when the news is too dark, when your own failures and regrets pile up until you can barely breathe under the weight, the memory of that one perfect moment keeps you going. That time when you felt for just a second what home is supposed to feel like. And that memory is proof that the promises aren't fantasy, that something better really exists, that you've tasted it even if only for a moment. And once you've tasted it, you can never forget, can never stop hungering for more. So here's what the Garden of Eden means for you today, right now, sitting wherever you are listening to these words. It means you're not crazy for feeling like something's missing. You're not broken for wanting more than this world offers. You're not defective for being unable to settle for the compromises and half-truths and temporary pleasures that everyone says should be enough. You're homesick, and that's appropriate, because you're not home. Not yet. Eden behind you and Eden ahead of you, and you're suspended between them in this beautiful, broken, temporary world. And your job isn't to get back to Eden, because you can't. Not yet. The gate is still guarded, and the sword still turns, and you're not ready for what's on the other side. Your job is to live in a way that honors both the memory and the promise, to tend whatever small garden you've been given, even if it's only a windowsill with a single plant, to treat people with Eden-level kindness, even when they don't deserve it, especially when they don't deserve it. To create beauty, because beauty is a whisper of what was and what will be. To resist the corruption and violence and cruelty of the fallen world, not because you think you can fix everything, but because every act of goodness is a vote for the world as it should be, instead of the world as it is. And to wait, patiently, faithfully, through however many years or lifetimes it takes, for the day when the cherubim will lower their swords and step aside, when the frequency barrier will drop, and what's been hidden will become visible, when the gate will open, and those who've waited and worked and longed will finally walk through and find themselves in the place they've been reaching for their entire lives, without ever quite touching. If this journey stirred something in you, if you felt that longing rise up as we talked, and now it won't go back to sleep, don't push it down. Sit with it for a moment. Let it remind you that you're made for more than what you see, That ache is holy, and it's pointing you toward home. And if you found value in these hours we've spent together exploring this ancient mystery, if it helped you see differently, or feel less alone in your homesickness, or gave language to something you've always sensed but never named, press the like button. It tells me this matters, and it helps others who are feeling the same longing find their way here. Share it with someone who's been carrying that unnamed ache. Maybe this will give them permission to feel it fully instead of apologizing for it. Maybe it'll remind them they're not the only exile dreaming of return. The sun has climbed higher now. The forest around you is fully illuminated, birds singing and insects humming, and the ordinary world going about its business. But you're not seeing it the same way you did when we started. You're aware now of the layers, the dimensions beyond what eyes can see, the garden that exists one frequency away from where you're standing. You take one more breath of this air that isn't quite what it should be. You feel one more time the ache of living between worlds, and then you turn and walk back toward the life that's waiting for you. But you carry something with you now, a question and a promise, and a compass pointing toward home. Every choice you make from this moment forward is part of the long journey back. Every act of love is a step toward the gate. Every moment of beauty is a glimpse through the veil. And one day, whether in this life or the next, whether tomorrow or 1,000 years from now, you'll take the final step, and the sword will lower, and the light will shift, and you'll find yourself exactly where you always belonged, in the garden that never stopped waiting for you to become someone who could enter without being destroyed by the encounter. Until then, may your dreams be filled with gardens. May your longing keep you awake and reaching, and may the road rise up to meet you as you walk the long path home. So what really happened to the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve left? What became of paradise when its only inhabitants were expelled and the gate was sealed behind them? The answer, as we've discovered together, is that all three theories might be true in different ways, that reality is large enough and strange enough to contain multiple truths that seem contradictory, but aren't. Eden was destroyed in the flood. Physically, the geography that Adam knew was reshaped by waters that covered mountains and moved rivers and buried the original landscape under layers of sediment that would take millennia to settle. And Eden decayed without care. Ecologically, the perfect garden that required human hands to tend it was overtaken by thorns and wild growth. The trees that once bore fruit in season now tangled with weeds. The paths Adam walked disappeared under fallen leaves and new undergrowth until the garden blended back into wilderness. And Eden was relocated to another dimension, spiritually, preserved in some parallel state or hidden frequency where it continues in perfect condition, guarded by cherubim who maintain the barrier between fallen world and unfallen paradise, waiting for the day when that barrier can safely drop and the two realities can merge again. All of this is true simultaneously, because Eden was never just a place, it was a state, a condition, a relationship between God and humanity and creation. And when that relationship broke, the place had to change to reflect the change in relationship. But the essence, the reality of what Eden represents, was preserved somewhere beyond the reach of flood or decay or time. You're living in the epilogue of one story and the prologue of another, the long middle chapter between gardens, and every choice you make is part of that narrative arc that bends toward restoration. Every act of kindness is a thread pulling you toward home. Every moment of beauty is a preview of what's coming. Every time you feel that ache of displacement, you're feeling the memory of where you came from and the promise of where you're going. And that ache isn't meant to torture you, but to orient you, to keep you from getting too comfortable in exile, to remind you that this isn't all there is. The you that might enter Eden someday won't be the same you that was expelled in Adam. You'll be stronger because you've known weakness, wiser because you've made mistakes and learned from them, more capable of appreciating paradise because you've lived in its absence and understand through contrast what was lost and what's being restored. And maybe that's the whole point of the exile. Not punishment for punishment's sake, but transformation. the long education that turns innocent children who could lose paradise through one wrong choice into mature adults who've been tested by every possible temptation and chosen faithfully despite the cost, who've learned to love goodness not because it's easy, but because it's true, who've become the kind of beings who could live in paradise forever without corrupting it because they've been purified by the journey. Will we ever know for certain what happened to Eden? Will archaeologists dig in the right place and find evidence of the original garden? Will scientists discover the frequency where it still exists and develop technology to perceive across dimensional barriers? Will the gate simply open one day and remove all doubt? Maybe not in this life. Maybe the uncertainty is part of the test. Maybe faith requires not knowing everything, only trusting that the story ends well, even when the middle is dark and confusing. But the question itself has value, even if the answer remains partially hidden. Because asking what happened to Eden keeps us looking up, looking forward, longing for more than what we have. And maybe God doesn't answer the question completely because He wants us to keep asking, to stay awake and aware, and reaching instead of settling into comfortable certainty or comfortable despair. The mystery keeps us seeking. The longing keeps us humble. The uncertainty keeps us dependent on promises instead of proof. And all of that might be exactly what we need to become people who can enter paradise when the gate finally opens. Let the silence settle now. Let everything we've explored together sink deep into whatever part of you receives truth that's bigger than facts. You've traveled far in this journey, through theories about floods and decay and parallel dimensions, through testimonies of prophets who glimpsed what shouldn't be possible, through prophecies promising that what was lost will be found and what was closed will open. And if you're tired, that's good. That's appropriate. Because this wasn't meant to be easy entertainment or comfortable affirmation. This was meant to wake something up in you that's been sleeping, to name a longing you've been carrying without words for it, to give you permission to feel the weight of exile and the hope of return in the same breath. Rest for a moment. Feel the ground beneath you, the air around you, the life pulsing in your chest. This world, broken as it is, still carries echoes of Eden in every sunrise and every act of love and every moment of beauty that catches you off guard. And you, weary traveler between gardens, are part of the story that will end where it began, in a place where rivers run clear and trees bear fruit, and the presence of God is so close you can walk with Him in the cool of the day. The gate is still guarded, the sword still turns, the frequency barrier still holds, but not forever, not permanently, only until the appointed time, when those who've waited and worked and been transformed by the waiting will finally hear the voice that says, "Come, you who are blessed, enter the garden prepared for you since the foundation of the world." That day might be tomorrow, or 1,000 years from tomorrow, but it's coming. The promise is made, and God doesn't break promises. And in the meantime, you live between the memory and the hope, carrying forward what was and backward what will be, until they meet in the present and change how you see everything. If this journey meant something to you, if you felt that longing rise up and recognized yourself in the story of exile and homecoming, press the like button, not for me, but as a way of saying, I felt it too. I'm homesick too. I'm waiting too. And if you want to continue this journey through other mysteries in the next video, I'll be here, waiting for you on the other side of sleep, in the silence between breaths, wherever seekers gather to ask questions that don't have easy answers. Until then, may you find thin places where the veil grows transparent. May your longing keep you reaching toward home. May you see with new eyes the beauty that surrounds you even in exile. And may your dreams be filled with gardens and rivers and light that comes from no source you can name, reminding you that paradise isn't behind you, but ahead of you. Not lost, but waiting. Not destroyed, but but preserved for the moment when you'll finally be ready to walk through the gate and hear the words you've been waiting your whole life to hear. Welcome home.